Welcome to the Beyond Ljubljana podcast. I'm your host, Noah Charney. In each episode, we embark on a journey to discover the hidden gems, captivating stories, and unique experiences waiting to be uncovered. Let's get started. Slovenia is the land of castles, and for an American like me, that is very exciting and exotic because, of course, America has no castles, no proper ancient ones that aren't Disneyfied. And so to come to a country that has more than 100 castles and that used to have many more than that is just mind blowing. It seems like you turn to every hilltop and it's got this magnificent castle perched on it. I got interested in what happens inside castles through a castle called Bogenspark, which is one of the ones I want to tell you about today. When I got to film there, I was filming an episode of a Travel Channel show called Mysteries at the Castle. And we were on site at Bogenspark, and I had heard of the former owner of Bogenspark Castle, a guy named Yannis Valvasor, a baron of Germanic Slovenian origin who lived from 1641 to 1693. And he was a polymath, meaning he was interested in all sorts of different things. He was a Renaissance man during the Baroque period. He was interested in science, but he was interested in science during a time when science was really an underdeveloped realm of study. And the scientists who did study the world and looked for evidence and natural explanations for things, well, they also believed in the supernatural. They were deeply religious. They believed in witches and demons and ghosts and magic and miracles. And they were trying to reconcile science, which says, show me evidence of something, otherwise I'm not going to believe it, with faith and belief in magic. And I had first gotten interested in Valvasor when I learned about his research into the disappearing lake of Slovenia, which immediately sounds intriguing, right? It sounds like the plot of a mystery novel. There's a lake called Cerknica, which for half the year is Slovenia's largest lake. And for the other half of the year, there's no water in it. It's a very large pasture. And the lake drains every year, disappears. And for most of human existence in this part of the world, this was chalked up to magic. There were witches on a nearby mountain called Slivnica who used incantations to make the water disappear and reappear. Well, Vavasor was someone who believed in witches, and among his many projects, he set up a printing press in his home, which actually led to him going bankrupt because his books weren't selling as well as he had hoped. But he printed books about magic and the supernatural. And he had also developed a scientific theory for why Lake Cerknica drains. And it has to do with it being built above a network of limestone caves. And he had a theory of hydraulics, the study of water and pressure and how it moves underground, that turned out to be pretty close to what scientists today believe is the actual reason why Cerknica is what is today called by scientists an intermittent lake. But Valvasor was interesting because he was right at the cusp of belief in the supernatural is 100% real and wanting to find scientific explanations for things that had previously been chalked up to the supernatural. So this is a cool guy. But he's got other elements of him that I found totally intriguing. So he was living in the 17th century. Like most nobles of the time in this part of the world, he served in the Habsburg army that was fighting their traditional rivals, the Ottoman Turks. So he was a soldier. He was captured. He lived in a Turkish prison for a while. He managed to get out. And he also spent 2 years traveling through Africa on a grand tour. We're used to grand tours about a century later of, British nobles and great thinkers traveling around Europe. Well, he was traveling around Africa at a time when there were amazing empires in places like Nigeria and Mali that we tend to overlook because we're a little bit too Eurocentric in our history. But he spent 2 years exploring them. And unfortunately, we don't know much of what he saw, but it must have been entirely amazing and remarkable. He also is the first person to publish a book that talks about vampires. And this was cool because I wound up writing a book that came out in fall of 2023 called The Slavic Myths, with a whole chapter on vampires because vampires are a Slavic mythological creature. And several hundred years before Bram Stoker published the novel Dracula, which made vampires a household name, they were already hugely popular in the decades leading up to that publication. But the very first person to write about vampires in a book was Valvasor. And so I got interested in this guy. And so I wanted to visit his castle. And, he was a pretty big deal for the time he lived in. He was quoted by the famous philosopher Immanuel Kant. He was admired by Sir Hans Sloane, who was the founder of the British Museum. He was admitted as a member to the prestigious Royal Society in London in 1687. The guy who nominated him was Edmund Halley, whose name might be familiar because of Halley's Comet that's named after him. He provided inspiration for Jonathan Swift, the author of Gulliver's Travels, and of course for Bram Stoker, who wrote Dracula. So he's hugely influential, but just about nobody knows about him. So this was kind of cool. And also, from a historian standpoint, he forecast what's called social history, which is the anthropological interest in preserving the stories, the habits, the traditions of local, I'm going to say, unimportant people, by which I mean the general public. And until a couple centuries later, really until the 19th century, historians thought, you write history about kings and soldiers like generals and popes. You write about the big famous people and you write about things like big battles, but nobody's interested in the daily life of a serf or a farmer or something like that. And that wouldn't come really until the 19th century. Well, Valvasor was interested in exactly that. So he forecast by about 200 years this interest in social history of the lives of everyday people. So he is a big deal who deserves a giant biography. Maybe one day I'll get around to writing it. I'm not sure. But you can learn all about him at his castle, Bogensburg, one of the castles that I'd like to tell you about today. Everything you could want to know about Valvasor is on display at Bogensburg Castle, which was Valvasor's home for much of his life. It includes all sorts of exhibits that are not directly related to him, but which he wound up writing about. So the thing that most people know in terms of cultural output is his 1689 magnum opus book, which runs more than 1,000 pages, and it's called Glory of the Duchy of Carniola. It's basically an encyclopedia of natural and folk history of the region of what is now northern Slovenia. At the time it was part of the Habsburg Empire. He was writing in German. And he's writing, traveling throughout his territory and writing about things he sees and traditions there. So it's got a little bit of an echo of Pliny the Elder's Natural History, which was written in ancient Rome. Here's a version written for this area that's now northern Slovenia, and it gave a really good impression of what life was like and what people believed in. And it combines this genuine belief in magic and the supernatural, which was rational in the mindset of his era, with early attempts to override paranormal explanations and look for observable scientific reasons for the behavior of the natural world. And I mentioned the why does Lake Tsernitsa disappear each year? Well, you can chalk it up to the supernatural, but he said, well, maybe there's a natural explanation. But you also find exhibits in Bogensburg Castle that include a very elaborate taxidermy wildlife exhibit of animals from the region, including lynx and badger and falcons, you name it. Exhibits on Purentovanje, which is a very unusual Slovene tradition that is actually an ancient pagan ritual where people dress in these amazing costumes that look like giant bear monsters. And they dance and parade every year as part of the Carnival Lent tradition. And the idea is that these are benevolent demons who chase away winter and invite in the spring. So he wrote about them. He wrote about witchcraft and folk remedies. And there's a whole section in the castle on printmaking because Valvasor invested his fortune in printmaking for printed books. It didn't really work out for him. He went bankrupt due to the book publishing endeavors that didn't sell as well as he hoped. But we can be grateful that he did because he produced a number of important books, the most famous of which is this Glory of the Duchy of Carniola. So this is really a castle to visit if you're interested in Valvasor, and I hope my brief introduction piqued your interest in him, but also in the folk traditions, the way people lived historically in this part of the world, but also what they believed in, with this emphasis on witchcraft and the supernatural and Kuruntvanya as demons chasing away the spirit of winter. It's intriguing from a supernatural standpoint as well as scientific. I mentioned as part of Valvasor's amazing life his time in a Turkish prison. And while he was there, one of the things he claimed to learn was a recipe for making gunpowder that would explode more than once. It would cause a chain reaction. This sounds pretty intriguing if you're thinking about high tech James Bond like gadgetry back in the 17th century. Well, he had been part of the Habsburg army that was constantly fighting the Ottomans, had been for centuries in a bid to control Europe. And about 20 kilometers southeast of Ljubljana is a 13th century castle called Tuak Castle. And it began as a feudal stronghold where it was expanded to fend off Ottoman invasion. We got to be honest here, Slovenia historically wasn't wealthy enough to interest the Ottoman army for settlement. It was subject to raids when the army passed through on their way to more enticing targets, and Vienna was always the crown jewel that the Ottomans wanted to take over and never managed to win. Slovenia is full of fortified churches, and you have to imagine what would happen if the Ottoman army passed through Slovenia. Well, they weren't coming to stay; they weren't coming to be occupied because there wasn't enough strategic rationale and enough loot to make it worth their while. But they were passing through, and what they would be doing is usually trying to gather supplies, like trying to steal livestock from farmers, this sort of thing, to feed the army on its way to more important targets. And in order to try to keep one step ahead of them, and you have to keep in mind there was no standing army here because it wasn't valuable enough for the Habsburgs to think we must defend this and leave a standing army here. There were local militias, there were, smaller troops that were stationed at the castles of local feudal lords, but there wasn't any giant army that was going to fend off the Ottomans. So they developed an early warning system. They would set up wood piles on hilltops, and each hilltop would be within the view of two other hilltops, also with wood piles set up. And if one of the scouts who would keep watch at all times on the hill towers, if they would see an army approaching, they would set fire to the wood pile and create this enormous bonfire. And the bonfire would be visible from two other hilltops. That was the strategy of where these would be laid out. Those two other hilltops would say, okay, there's a bonfire. There must be an army coming. I have to send a warning. So they would light these other bonfires, and it would become this chain reaction throughout the country. The Ottoman army is coming. And what happens if you see that? Well, if you live near a fortified church, the primary tactic would be to gather what you can, rush inside the church, lock yourself in, and start praying fiercely because there wasn't really anything you could do because the people living in the territory known as Slovenia were in no position to fight off the Ottoman army. If you were in a more rural setting, you would grab what you can and head for the forests and try to disappear into the forest and hope that nobody noticed because it wasn't worth combing the forest for random locals who were hiding out there. People would just become the victims of the Turkish army if they tried to defend their property. So it would be pillaged, and then the army would move on. Well, it was originally thought that the name Tuak Castle comes from some origin linked to fighting the Turks. Or another theory was that it was named after an extinct breed of giant cattle that once roamed Europe called aurochs. They're now extinct. The word for them is tur in Slovene. But the truth is probably more mundane. It probably derived from the name of the family that first built the castle, the Ursbergs, and later their name was changed to von Auersburg. The castle's most famous son was Andreas von Auersburg, who was once described as the Carniolan Achilles for his military prowess. This is a great title. He commanded forces from Carinthia and Carniola, which are the two northern regions of what is today Slovenia, at the famous Battle of Sisak, defeating the Ottomans on the 22nd of June, 1593. The Auersburgs were also Protestant sympathizers in the 16th century, and this is at a time when it was dangerous to do so. They supported the first prominent Slovenian Protestants, Primož Trubar, who was a local. He grew up in a village nearby this castle called Velike Lašče, and Jure Dalmatin. The castle was also the setting for a famous ballad written by Slovenia's leading Romantic era poet, France Prešeren, called Rosamund of Turiak. It tells a story of the attempts to win the heart of a spoiled heiress who lived at the castle. If you visit, you can learn about all of these stories, and it's a very impressive castle. You can imagine stout knights along the ramparts fending off the Ottoman invasion. It also contains frescoes, there's an arm in armor exhibit, and some slightly creepy lifelike mannequins if you're into that sort of thing. Now we get to my hometown local. My adopted hometown, Konik, is actually pretty cool because it features 3.5 castles. So there's Maligrad, or Little Castle, in the center of town, and that's the icon of Kamnik. You can see it in the photos. That's the one that they're likely to put in. And that's the oldest of the castles. There's also Starigrad, Old Castle, just to confuse you, which isn't quite as old as Little Castle. That's on a cliff overlooking Kamnik, and that's just a ruin at this point. And then there's Zaprice Castle, which is really more of a Baroque manor house, but which contains a very good regional museum. If If you're curious, I said 3.5 castles. The half a castle is a 19th century industrialist's mansion called Grad Katzenberg. It's got the word castle in its name, Grad, but it's really just a very large house. But Zaprice is my local museum. I can see it from my study as I'm recording this. And I visited it and filmed in it often. So it was first mentioned in 1306. And like Tuak Castle, it became known for housing and supporting Protestants, in this case, Lutherans, before Protestantism was legal. What we see today is a Baroque remodeling from the late 17th and early 18th centuries. And if you go up there, you get this really great expansive view of my charming mountain town of Konik. And inside, there's some really good exhibits, and it's particularly good if you're traveling with young children. I used to go there with my daughters quite often, and they have lots of interactive exhibits, things that you can poke and play with. It's got an exhibit of a mammoth skeleton that was found nearby that's one of the symbols of Kamnik. It's one of the best preserved mammoth fossils found in Europe, and it was found in a riverbed just about a kilometer from the center of Kamnik. And the main fossil set is at the Natural History Museum in Ljubljana, but there's an exhibit on it here. There's also an exhibit on a local band of Napoleonic army deserters turned Robin Hood-like bandits called the Rokmonjaci. And so that's intriguing. And then we have exhibits on the castles of Kamnik, on medieval trades and crafts. Then you go upstairs, and there's a very beautiful frescoed. Now it's a concert hall, but it would really originally have been probably a dining room. And that's where I filmed a whole course on lost art, which is part of Wondrium or the Teaching Company's Great Courses series. And that was fun to do. We spent many days one winter in that room filming. So it feels a little bit like my hometown local castle, and it really is for the number of times I visited it. If you head upstairs, you can also see an exhibit on Velika Planina, this magnificent mountain plateau that has its unique cultural history to it that's just outside of Kamnik, and it's a place that you should certainly visit if you have time to. There's an exhibit on shipping in Yugoslavia, which is a little bit unusual, but includes model ships. You can also see exhibits on various archaeological findings that were part of discoveries around Kamnik, and also the industrial heritage of Kamnik, because Kamnik was a major center for industry during the time of Yugoslavia. The story of Kamnik is told in this museum. It was originally established not as a Roman settlement, but as a Germanic one run by the Bavarian Andechs family. And it was a stop on trade routes between Celje and Ljubljana. And it was actually a much more important town than Ljubljana for most of the last 1,000 years or so. One of the ways we know this is that it had its own mint, and a town that minted its own coins was particularly important. That was a mark of its elevation. And the Andechs family shifted trade routes, so you had to pass through Kamnik, and their rationale was because they wanted to protect you from bandits and whatnot. But in practice, it's because they wanted to tax you. And as a result, it was quite a wealthy and vibrant place at a time where Ljubljana really was not. It wouldn't become so until really the 20th century. So this is a place that you should visit if you get a chance to. If you're interested in history, Kamnik, I highly recommend. It's my adopted hometown, and I'm a big fan of it. And this castle is a great place to visit, especially if you have children. From Bogenspurt to Turjak to Zaprice and beyond, Slovenia is a land of castles. And for me, when I was a young American coming from a country without castles, castle visits were the highlight of family holidays in Europe. Even today, seeing ramparts on the horizon brings out my inner child. So, if you see somebody playing on the ramparts, pretending to duel imaginary enemies, especially at Zaprice Castle, you're welcome to stop me and say hi. This has been an episode of the Beyond Ljubljana podcast, brought to you by Ljubljana Tourism.